I'm Will the Gamer, and today I want to talk about the Lizardmen. Similar to the demi-humans, the Lizardmen are separated into two different subspecies. The first and most numerous subspecies looks like a humanoid version of a salamander. They stand at 4 to 5 feet tall with 3 fingers and 3 toes, though they only generally appear to be about 3 to 4 feet tall as they are always hunched over. They have the head of a salamander with a very long tail, while each of their 3 fingers and 3 toes has a small talon on it. They have the eyes of a lizard and brightly colored scales covering their entire body. These scales act very similarly to that of a chameleon, allowing them to blend in with their background whenever they're afraid. The other subspecies is a large humanoid alligator. They can stand at about 6 to 7 feet tall, but will usually hunch themselves over, appearing only about 5 to 6 feet tall. They have 4 webbed fingers and 4 webbed toes with claws on the end of them. They have a thick layer of scales covering their entire body, with crocodile-like ridges covering their back, all the way from their head to their tail. Their entire body is covered with very large muscles, particularly in the chest and back region. These two subspecies make up a caste system within the Lizardmen. The smaller subspecies is known as the Lacreton. However, most people call them gecko men or geckos. This regardless of the fact that they don't look like geckos. The larger subspecies is known as the Crocodilus, though most people call them crocodile men or for short, crocs. The gecko men are by far more numerous than the crocs. They make up by themselves more than 4/5 of the Lizardmen population. As such, the geckos make up the majority of Lizardmen society. They do most of the day-to-day tasks and also form the priesthood. As far as the game is concerned, they can be the following classes: Archer, Mage, Shaman, Thief, and Warlock. The Crocodilus, on the other hand, form both the ruling and warrior caste. However, Lizardmen's society is rather strange. Unlike the other races who worship the gods of war, destiny, and life, they worship the god of death. They believe that the god of death will keep you by his side for all of eternity if you are a worthy soul. If you are not, the goddess of life will rebirth you onto the world. They believe that it is the greatest honor to sit beside the god of death for all of eternity. However, they believe that only certain people are born into this world in order to become the god of death's favorite toys. They believe these favored people are the Crocodilus. However, the way that they treat the Crocodilus is slightly askew. Yes, the Crocodilus are treated like kings, getting anything and everything that they want. However, all this treatment is only to prepare them for their inevitable deaths. From the moment a Crocodilus is born, they are sentenced to death. And throughout their lifetimes, they must undergo the Rites of Passage. These rites are all lethal in their own right, and scale progressively as they get older. You see, the Crocodilus's rites of passage are fighting deadly monsters that are many times bigger than they are. They undergo these rites in order to show that they are worthy to the god of death. However, the Lizardmen believe when a Crocodilus dies, they are simply reborn into the next generation of that family, essentially reincarnating the soul of the dead Crocodilus into a new body. So when a Crocodilus dies on the Rites of Passage, their body is entombed forever within the family catacombs. Each one of these tombs describing how the Crocodilus died and why they failed at their rite of passage. Then the new generation of Crocodilus will try and learn from their failures. If a Crocodilus does pass all their rites of passage, they then have to fight the incarnation of death itself. Or at least what the Lizardmen call the incarnation of death, which happens to be a black swamp dragon. As you may have guessed, no Lizardman has ever succeeded in single-handedly defeating a black dragon. As such, some of the oldest Crocodilus catacombs are miles and miles deep. However, these catacombs also act as a metropolis of their own, each one of them forming what is essentially a Lizardman city. Each new tomb that is added to the catacombs makes another block for the city to grow. These catacombs, however, would be very difficult for most people to find. First off, they are in a noxious swamp whose poisons will kill anyone who's not a Lizardman. But if you were, say, to prepare for the poisonous swamps, then you might have to fight through all the dangers of the swamp itself. Giant flying insects, massive spiders, giant snakes, and of course the occasional black dragon. However, if you can make it past all of those dangers, the entrance to the catacombs are always hidden. A small staircase between a few rocks and trees, a hidden underwater entrance, and some of the more elaborate catacombs even have locking doors, only allowing the people behind them to unlock them. However, if you were to step into these catacombs, you wouldn't think they were a tomb. Instead, you would find massive city streets built of stone, artificial rivers made from the water of the swamps, farms that use magical lanterns in order to keep them growing 24 hours a day, with vast housing and market complexes that can suit your every desire. Now you might ask yourself why the crocodilus would willingly take up these deadly tasks. Well, from their very birth, the crocodilus are treated like kings by the gecko men. They are also indoctrinated into the god of death's religion. They are essentially told from day one that they are the god of death's chosen people. They also know that each time one of them dies, a massive tomb is erected for them in their honor. The more rites of passage the crocodilus performed, the greater the tomb will be. This also expands the catacomb and allows their family to become even greater. The greater your family becomes, the greater prestige and honor the next generation gets, thus passing on a greater lineage from generation to generation. So the crocodilus not only find it a religious honor, but also a family honor. The gecko men playing a subservient role, but not having to do any rites of passage themselves. However, the gecko men consider themselves only one step below the crocodilus. This, however, was not always the case. So far I've talked about the general society of the Lizardmen, but now I want to talk about their history. What would be known as the quote-unquote Lizardmen started appearing around the Age of Monsters. What would later be known as the gecko men covered the majority of the southeastern swamps. However, they were being hunted by a much larger species that would be later known as the crocodilus. The gecko men were in fact the crocodilus's main food source. On top of this, the crocodilus laid many eggs at one time, increasing their population rapidly. Because of this, the gecko men feared that they would one day be overrun and be made extinct. Fearing extinction, the gecko men put their heads together to try and come up with a solution, as they could not just simply outright kill the crocodilus. However, they simply couldn't come together and find a solution to get rid of them. It was then that a lone gecko man met a passing troll shaman. Curious as to what the shaman was, he asked a bunch of questions. At this point, the troll shaman enlightened him to the gods. The troll told him about the pantheon of gods that was said to rule over all aspects of life. He even went into great detail about each and every one of them. At this point, the troll was probably trying to convert them to his religion. However, he didn't realize how successful this would be. The gecko seemed to take the most interest in the god of death and wanted to know more and more about him. After what felt like hours explaining what the god was like, the gecko man ran off without saying another word. Very confused by this, the troll simply shrugged and went on his way. The gecko men, however, would go back to his tribe and tell them everything that he had learned. From this, the gecko men devised a completely different plot. Instead of getting rid of the crocodilus, they would control them. It was at this point that a gecko-man shaman decided to use the spirits in order to show a vision to the crocodilus leaders, all of them seeing the same exact vision, a vision of the god of death. The god of death would then tell the crocodilus that he was very disappointed in them, that while the crocodilus were his favorite children, his favorite servants were the gecko men, and they kept killing them. He then continued to tell them that there was no honor in killing prey, and they would not sit beside him so long as they continued to kill the gecko men, instead saying that they would have to fight increasingly difficult enemies in order to appease him. At first, the gecko men weren't sure how well their ploy had succeeded. All they knew is that for several days, attacks on the gecko men had completely stopped. When some of the gecko men had gathered up the courage to go check on the crocodilus, they found them fighting giant monsters. The ploy had worked perfectly. This helped the gecko men in a myriad of ways, the first and most obvious being that the gecko men were no longer being hunted by the crocodilus. The second benefit being that the crocodilus were now hunting the monsters that also hunted gecko men. And the third was that the crocodilus's population was kept in check. However, this simply didn't feel like enough, so the shaman continued his visions. He showed the god of death to the leaders of the crocodilus once more. This vision, however, was much different. This time the god of death said that he was pleased with the efforts of the crocodilus. It also said that if they continued to fight the monsters, they would be worshipped like kings. And thus, in an effort to please the god of death, they fought ever more dangerous monsters. The Gecko-men, seeing their efforts, decided to come and serve them. At first it was a bit awkward for both of them, but the Crocodilus came around once they started being treated like kings. The Gecko-men then shared their visions with the Crocodilus, giving them the Rites of Passage. With each Rite of Passage completed by the Crocodilus, the Gecko-men would have even more lavish parties for them. And for every Crocodilus that died, the Gecko-men would treat their bodies like a passing king. Thus, each ruling clan of the Crocodilus would have a subservient Gecko-men clan. Over the years, the rituals for the Rites of Passage became more complex, and the burial of each Crocodilus became even more so. And thus it continued on until it became what it is today. And the Gecko-men who had known about the plot never told anyone else, and the plot died with them, and so no one knows any better. For if the Crocodilus were ever to know the truth, the outcome for the Gecko-men might be a bit sour. Now that should cover the majority of the basic history of the Lizardmen. If you guys have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. And as always, I'm Will the Gamer, signing out.